All right, welcome everyone. Let's take a look at a very, very important concept, something that you'll use not only in class, but hopefully even more importantly in your clinical practice. So let's take a look at something called Starling's hypothesis. So this is not to be confused. Whoops, let's start that again. Not to be confused with Starling's law. I can't write today. This is Starling's hypothesis. And Starling's hypothesis is a way of representing fluid movement at the capillary level and the third space level. So let's take a look at what happens here. So we're going to start out by drawing a little venule. This is just a little capillary. This is the capillary here. This is the arterial end. This is the venule end. All right, so blood is traveling in this direction. This is a capillary, and around the capillary is the third space, or the interstitial space. I'm going to call it third space. All right, so right around the capillary, there's all this third space, this matrix that's here, and within the capillary, there are a couple things. So obviously, within the capillary, there is blood, and that's going to play an important component. And there are also proteins inside the capillary and inside the blood. And the most important protein we're going to look at here for the purposes of Starling's hypothesis is albumin. All right, so this is the general anatomy of this. We have this capillary, and the capillary has blood in it, and the blood contains a bunch of stuff. One of the things it contains is a very large protein molecule called albumin, which, by the way, is made by the liver. So Starling's hypothesis is a way that we can represent fluid balance and fluid shifting. So this refers to fluid balance. So anytime we have a fluid imbalance situation, meaning that there's edema somewhere, this Starling's hypothesis is going to play an important role in not only detecting what might be wrong with the patient, but also how to target certain things so that we can fix, even if it's just a time-buying measure, fix or buy time on how we can shift fluid back where it belongs. All right, so I'm going to use a couple different colors here to try to make this a little easier. But the first one I want to point out here is that there are going to be four forces, all right? And the four forces are going to be either a pushing force, all right, that's one, and the other force is going to be a pulling force. And I'm also going to say a drawing action, meaning that it's going to draw fluid in its direction. All right, so let's first look at the pushing forces. The first pushing force we're going to look at is actually blood pressure. And blood pressure is going to be a force that's located within the capillary, and blood pressure is going to be a force that pushes fluid from the capillary space into the third space. In the third space itself, there is also fluid here. And that fluid is, we're going to say it's water, and we're going to call this hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressure is the pressure of fluid that exists and exerts itself on the wall of the capillaries inside the third space. So the blood pressure is a pushing force. It pushes fluid outside the capillary. And in the third space, we also have a pushing force that is called the hydrostatic pressure. And that pushes fluid, that favors the movement of fluid from the third space into the capillary space itself. All right, now let's explore what the pulling forces are, or the drawing forces. Well, as you can imagine, since we mentioned this already, albumin is this large molecule. And large molecules have a pulling effect, meaning that they draw things in their direction. So albumin is the large protein molecule that's responsible for drawing fluid from the third space into the capillary area. And of course, in the third space, we also have other proteins that exist here. And the proteins inside the third space also exert this pulling force. So there are proteins in the third space that draw fluid from the capillary into the third space area. So actually, if you look at this, let's label these a little bit. we're going to call this the protein from the third space. I'm just going to say 3P. That's going to be the third space proteins. And I put that in the wrong place. Let me put that where it belongs. Let's put that here with 3P. The next one that we're going to call is going to call the capillary pressure. This is the force of the pressure that exists, that draws fluid from the third space into the capillary space. And this is, of course, from albumin's, that's albumin's responsibility. Then the next thing we're going to look at is blood pressure and hydrostatic pressure. So these are the pushing forces. They push fluid. Hydrostatic pressure pushes into the capillary. Blood pressure pushes out of the capillary. So if we were to take and make this equation, BP plus HP plus CP plus 3P, our number should equal 0. That means that the net loss of fluid from the capillary and from the third space is equal to 0, meaning that there's no imbalance. That means that if we lose 1 cc of fluid to the third space, we gain a cc from the third space also. So it's this constant moving across this capillary membrane and this constant movement, this fluid balance, this constant movement. When it's all equal to 0, we have a normal system. Fluid is equal. We don't lose more from the capillary than we gain from the third space and vice versa. And this is the concept of Starling's hypothesis. Now, based on this, we can do a tremendous amount of stuff. So for example, let's start with a fresh sheet of paper here, and let's take a look at our different forces. So we're going to start out again with our capillary. Here's our capillary, and this capillary has blood pressure. It has albumin. It's got hydrostatic pressure, and it has third space proteins. All right, cool. So let's take a look at what happens now in certain situations. If in fact we take a patient and their blood pressure is 220 over 110 millimeters of mercury, let's take a look at what effect that will have. So here before we had a pushing pressure, but now the pushing pressure is going to be a lot stronger than it was when the blood pressure was 120 over 80 or 100 over 70. Everything else stays the same. Hydrostatic pressure still pushing in. We have our drawing pressure of albumin. We have our third space that is drawing fluid from the capillaries. But now if we look at this equation, what we'd find is we have the albumin stays the same. The third space proteins stay the same. Hydrostatic pressure stays the same. So the amount of fluid that we're pulling in, that was the same as in the previous slide. The amount of pressure that's pushing fluid back into the third space from hydrostatic pressure is the same. But now our blood pressure is causing an excess of fluid. So we have a shift of fluid. And that shift is into the third space. So when we have third space shifting, for example, in the legs, we see edema. Right, so one mechanism for edema in the legs is an increase in blood pressure. If we have an increase in blood pressure, that causes us to shift fluid more so into the third space than we do back into the capillaries, and as a result, we get edema wherever that is. So in the case of the legs, think about the pressure here. If we have a patient that's standing, if you're standing for way too long, you get swollen ankles, swollen feet. That's in part because we've got an increase in pressure that's happening within the capillaries. It's causing more leakage to take place inside the third space. You get edema in your legs. How do you resolve that? Well, you can do a couple things. You can lower the blood pressure. How do you lower the blood pressure in your legs? You raise your legs. You put them up on a chair. You put them up on a counter. You lie back and you lift your legs up on a pillow, and that resolves that. So some diseases can be caused by that. So think about too much salt intake. If you have too much salt intake, you increase the amount of overall volume that exists in here. If you increase the volume, in theory, you increase the blood pressure. If you keep the container size the same, If you increase the volume, increase the blood pressure, you increase the blood pressure, you get edema. So think about what happens in those cases. All right, so that's just one example. All right, so let's take a look at another example. Another example would be, let's take another capillary here. We'll eliminate some of this mess. We're going to say the BP is normal, the albumin is low, hydrostatic pressure normal, and the oncotic pressure. Oncotic pressure just means, this is the fancy term to say the pressure that's a result of the third space proteins, is the same. So these guys, they're normal, blood pressure is normal, albumin is low. So let's take a look at what happens. Blood pressure pushes out like it normally does, hydrostatic pressure pushes against it. Oncotic pressure draws fluid from the capillary. And now, instead of having a good draw because of albumin, we don't have quite enough draw on fluid because albumin is low or it's absent. As a result, we get more leakage out into the third space. This equals, you betcha, edema. So anytime we have edema, we've already identified that it can be a blood pressure problem, it can be a protein problem such as albumin. All right, so those are the two big ones that I want to mention right now because these are things that we're going to target in a little bit. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the things that you probably know. We're gonna target a little bit of a different approach here. So now, instead of being in the legs, let's go to the lungs. Here's a capillary. This is at the level of the lungs. So this will be the alveolar capillary membrane. So this is going to be an alveolus. All right, this is a little alveolar sac. This is one alveolus. This is a capillary. All right, and this is just my rendition. This is the best I can do with the drawing. And so the capillary is surrounding the alveolus, and oxygen is supposed to diffuse here. So we have oxygen that's coming in through the lungs, through the mouth, and coming in here. Oxygen's diffusing into the capillary, and it's making red blood cells completely full of oxygen. And of course, CO2 is here, and it's diffusing back across, and we're going to bring that, and we're going to exhale that at some point. So now let's take a look at what happens here. So in this particular case, Starling's hypothesis is still in full effect. Here we have blood pressure. Here we have albumin. Now things are a little bit different at the alveolar capillary membrane. The blood pressure is not 120/80 here. It's something very, very low. The pulmonary circuit works very low. It might be like, let's say 15 millimeters or 20 millimeters of mercury. All right, really, really low. So this is already a tenth of what we're normally used to when we're evaluating pressure in the extremities. All right, so we're looking already at a smaller pressure. So that's already good because we've decreased the blood pressure. Now let's take a look at what happens. What pressure exists inside the alveoli that will help offset the blood pressure's pressure pushing fluid into the alveolar space? So right now, as it stands, if we just had blood pressure pushing out and we had albumin drawing back in, we would have a little bit of a net movement of fluid from the capillary space into the alveoli, and that would be bad. We would get then fluid inside our lungs, and that's not a good thing. That also impacts the diffusion of oxygen and CO2, because if we put a thicker layer here, or we wet this layer by putting water inside, now we get some problems. So in fact, what we have here is we have atmospheric pressure that's pushing inside our pulmonary system, and it is offsetting this blood pressure effect. So essentially we have blood pressure pushing, we have albumin pulling, and now we have intrapulmonary pressure, which is essentially atmospheric pressure. It is offsetting this blood pressure movement, and it is forcing pressure in this direction, which keeps our lungs nice and dry so we don't have an imbalance. Now let's take a patient that has a heart problem. So of course, as you remember, the right ventricle pumps to the pulmonary system and the left side of the heart receives it. All right, so this is the left heart. Now, If we take this situation and we say the left heart for some reason has died, meaning that it's had an infarction, like it's had a heart attack, there was some issue with it. So we have a heart failure patient, a left-sided heart failure patient. If you look at what happens in left-sided heart failure, what we end up getting is a backup into the pulmonary system, a backup of fluid specifically. So if you increase the amount of fluid that exists in here, so you increase the volume inside the capillary, that is going to lead to an increase in pressure inside the capillary. So if you increase blood pressure here, everything else stays the same. What you end up developing is an imbalance, and that imbalance costs you because it creates water or fluid inside the alveolar space. And this you can hear by listening to the patient. You'll hear rales. The patient will be short of breath. All sorts of things start to happen, right? Oxygen diffusion doesn't take place as efficiently. CO2 diffusion doesn't take place as efficiently. So lots of problems that take place. So this is an important concept, and this is one of the great examples that I can provide for you of a real-life example of why you need to know this information. Because when you get a patient that's got rales or fluid on the lungs, you should start thinking, hey, I can fix that. And I can fix that because I understand that Starling's hypothesis only really impacts a couple things. It impacts pressure, it impacts volume, and if I can conceptualize those things, I can fix those things. So one of the things you can do if you have too much fluid inside the alveolar space, pretty simple. One of the very first things you can do is you can increase the atmospheric pressure or the intrapulmonary pressure. And we're going to do that with a device called CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure. So we're going to take pressure and we're going to force it into here. And when we force this pressure into here, it's going to offset the imbalance, whether it's volume, whether it's strict pressure, from heart failure or from any other sort of condition. If we increase the intrapulmonary pressure, in essence, what we're going to do is we're going to force all these little bubbles and all these little fluid guys to come back in here. And we should be able to get rid of some of the fluid there, right? Then we will promote oxygen diffusion, we will promote CO2 diffusion, and we will try to normalize and to stabilize the situation. All right, so just by doing what we talked about, which is increasing the intrapulmonary pressure, we can offset the issue that's here. All right, something else that we can do, we've targeted the pressure now. There's one other thing we can do, and that is the volume. Well, the patient that generally has heart failure has a normal volume. So if their normal circulating volume is 5 to 6 liters, today they also have 5 to 6 liters. It just so happens that it has shifted into the alveolar space. So you know that if you increase volume, you increase pressure. Therefore, at the same time, if you think about what would happen here, if I decrease the pressure, what would I do to the volume? I'm going to decrease the volume that exists. And when we talk about volume here, I'm not talking about the fluid volume necessarily. I'm talking about the volume of the overall container. All right, so this is the concept. The concept is one of the very first things I'm going to do is I'm going to apply pressure in the intrapulmonary space. I'm going to force this fluid back into the capillaries. Next, I'm going to take the capillaries and the veins and the arteries and everything else, the vascular system, and I'm going to decrease the pressure in here. And I'm going to decrease the pressure by changing the volume. And so this is the way I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the volume inside the container by making the container larger. So I'm going to give drugs that cause vasodilation. So if I give a medicine to make this vessel twice the size, if you looked at the vessel before and it was, I don't know, let's say it was 2 millimeters, and I make that vessel now 8 millimeters, I'm going to significantly change the pressure that's in here. So if the pressure in here was 60 millimeters of mercury, it might go down to 15 millimeters of mercury when I change this. Now, even though I've quartered this, this is not that case. All right, it doesn't quarter. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I just use numbers to show that there's going to be a marked reduction in the pressure that exists inside that capillary space. All right, so important things to remember. If I have a fluid imbalance situation, if the fluid imbalance happens to be in the legs in the third space, not a huge deal for right now. I'm not going to deal with that much. Same concept though, change the body region, move it to the lungs. Now if I have fluid in the lungs, wow, a couple things I can do. I can apply intrapulmonary pressure to offset the blood pressure problem. I can also decrease the pressure inside the capillary system or the vascular system. I can also decrease the volume that's here. So I could get rid of some of the volume. I could make the patient pee some of the volume off. What we know, however, from a lot of studies is that in heart failure patients specifically, that's not the problem. It's not a volume overload problem. It's usually a pressure problem, and it's a distribution problem. So we redistribute with pressure. We redistribute and promote movement of fluid back into the capillary space by changing the overall pressure inside the vessel by increasing the vessel size. All right, so I hope this is a pretty good example of how we can utilize and apply Starling's hypothesis to everyday practice. All right, stay tuned for more.